Section D, takings. The theory of property developed in Chapter 4 stresses that clear and certain property rights may facilitate bargaining, which creates a surplus from cooperation and exchange. Conversely, unclear and uncertain property rights may impede bargaining, which destroys the social surplus. The power of the state to take property, that is, to compel its sale to the state and regulate its use, reduces the clarity and certainty of property rights. The resulting destruction in social surplus represents the economic cost of the state's power to take property and regulate its use. Offsetting the economic cost is the benefit of providing public goods at lower costs. In this section, we develop these ideas into an economic theory of the taking and regulatory powers. In many countries, the Constitution circumscribes the state's power to take private property. For example, the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution reads, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." Thus, the Fifth Amendment prohibits the state from taking private property except under two conditions. One, the private property is taken for public use, and two, the owner is compensated. We will explain the economic rationale for these two conditions. Number one, compensation. To understand the compensation requirement, we proceed in two stages. First, we assume that there were no requirement to compensate, as was the case in England centuries ago, so that expropriating private property might be a means of financing the government. Second, assume that there is a requirement to compensate and examine its incentive effects for the government to use private property. We will examine compensation's effect on the private property owner's use of the property in a subsequent section. First, contrast takings and taxes as means of financing government. Taxes are assessed on a broad base, such as income, property, sales, or bequests. Everyone subject to the tax faces the same schedule of rates. In contrast, a taking involves a particular piece of property owned by a particular person. Tyrannies sometimes finance government and enrich officials by taking property from individuals. To finance the state by takings, the private owner whose property is appropriated must not receive compensation. If the private property owner received compensation equal to the market value for his or her property, the state could not profit from taking it. So the requirement of compensation can be viewed as a device to channel government finance into taxes and away from takings. Economics provides strong reasons for financing the state by taxes rather than takings. Any kind of expropriation distorts people's incentives and causes economic inefficiency. But taxes distort far less than uncompensated takings. To see why, consider the basic principle in public finance that focused taxes distort more than broad taxes. Applying this principle, a given amount of revenues can be raised with less distortion by a tax on food rather than vegetables, or a tax on vegetables rather than carrots. This principle follows from the fact that avoiding broad taxes is harder than avoiding narrow taxes. For example, avoiding a tax on food requires eating less, whereas avoiding a tax on carrots requires eating another vegetable, such as cucumbers. Broad taxes distort behavior less because many people cannot change their behavior to avoid broad taxes. Thus, efficiency requires the state to collect revenues from broad taxes such as income or consumption. Superscript 63, which reads, the precise proposition is that goods should be taxed at a rate inversely proportional to their elasticity of demand and supply. Broad taxes fall on aggregates that are inelastically demanded and supplied. Back to the text. In contrast, takings have a very narrow base. Individual owners will go to great expense to prevent the state from taking their property without compensation. Indeed, the possibility of uncompensated takings would divert effort and resources away from production and toward the politics of redistribution. Now, let us examine the effect of the compensation requirement on government's actions. Courts have held that the compensation requirement necessitates the government's paying roughly the fair market value to a property owner if her property is taken. For reasons that we will soon explain, the value may not be exactly what the owner would like or that would be reached in an arm's length transaction between the owner and another buyer. Nonetheless, the government cannot make money by paying the market value for property that it takes. This fact discourages the government from excessive takings of private property. Section 2. Public use. The requirement of compensation does not preclude another political abuse, in which the state takes one person's property and sells it to someone else. To appreciate the problem, consider the difference between a taking and a sale. Sales are motivated by mutual gain, which is created by moving property from lower valued to higher valued uses. To illustrate, Blair's purchase of Adams' 1957 Chevrolet creates a surplus because Blair values it more than Adam does. The fact that both parties must consent to the sale guarantees mutual gain. In contrast, a taking does not require the consent of the property owner, so unilateral gain can motivate a taking. A property owner may value his or her property more than whoever takes it. For example, assume that Samson owns his family's estate. The market value, which equals $30,000, but Samson does not want to sell it because he values the estate at $100,000 for sentimental reasons. Delilah covets Sam's estate and would be willing to pay up to $40,000 for it. Assume that the state can compel Samson to sell his property at its fair market value. So Delilah contributes $5,000 to the campaign fund of a prominent government official who takes Samson's estate, pays him $30,000, and resells the estate to Delilah for $30,000. Thus, Delilah and the government official each gained $5,000, although Samson loses $70,000. By taking Samson's property and giving it to Delilah, the state transfers property from one private person to another, so that Delilah does not have to pay Samson's subjective price for the estate. The requirement of compensation at market price does not prevent this abuse, which occurs because the owner's subjective value exceeds the market price paid as compensation. To eliminate the abuse, the state could compensate the owner's subjective price rather than the market price. However, no one but the owner knows the subjective price. In a voluntary sale, the owner receives at least the subjective price or does not sell. If the state wanted to compensate at least the owner's subjective price, the state would have to buy the property, not to take it. The public use requirement avoids the abuse in this example. Delilah's use of Samson's estate is private, not public. Consequently, the taking in this example violates the public use requirement. The public use requirement forbids the use of takings to bypass markets and transfer private property from one private person to another. Instead, property must be taken for a public use. For example, Samson's estate could be taken for a park, school, or highway. The public use requirement does not solve the problem of inefficiency in involuntary transfers. To illustrate, suppose that motorists would be willing to pay $40,000 to use a highway through Samson's estate, the market value of which is $30,000. By taking the land, paying Samson $30,000, and building a highway, the government anticipates a surplus of $10,000. In reality, Samson values his estate at $100,000. So the net social loss will equal $60,000, and Samson will lose $70,000. This example suggests that the state should not take property with compensation merely to produce a public good. In reality, the state buys most of the resources that it uses to supply public goods. For example, the state buys cement, pencils, trucks, light bulbs, and labor. In fact, takings are circumscribed more than the requirement of compensation and public use suggest.